I see the meaning crisis as, by analogy, because that's all I've got. Imagine that we're living in the afterglow of a dying star. You know, to me, that's what the Christian world is to me. That's what that. Now I mean this in ways that we don't have time to unpack today, but like that's where God lies for me, is that it's that by definition it's somehow continuous with the nature of the self, and that there's some infinite aspect of the self, the kind of infinite aspect that someone like Kierkegaard described, that has been lost to us, that we've been that's now what was formerly continuous is now discontinuous, and that, you know, the loss of that infinite aspect, the loss of the partaking in eternity, for instance, the partaking of eternity of the self that Christ symbolizes, is lost to us. Now, irrevocably, I don't know, right? I'm just describing a feeling. And the dying star analogy is the closest I've come to depicting both the existential despair of the problem and also the magnitude of the problem, right? Because there's nothing obvious to replace the archetypal image of Christ, right? To the West. And I'm speaking within certain boundaries. I want to be clear about that. But there's no obvious substitution for that. It's like every substitution that we grasp at, all it is just a pale. It's the same symbol, but just in different guises. You know, every pseudo-sacred or pseudo-religious substitution, and this is part of what John and I were talking about in our video, right? Every one that we can find is just you know, that symbol, that archetypal image of the behind in a different set of vestments. And we see that, right, with the various mythic fads and cultures, and calling them fads, I mean, I don't mean that they don't have value and import, and the play and the sense of participation that they induce does have value, and insofar as it refers us to the sacral importance of our fundamental symbols, I think that's valuable, because I think it reorients us and points us indexically in the direction that we actually ought to be looking. So insofar as they do that, I think those mythoi, if I can call them that, are valuable. But they're wizened, like they're feeble, and they can't solve anything, because all they are approximations of something that is slowly and gradually receding from us. And that's why that dying star example, it speaks to me so much, because it's such a slow and gradual declension. It's such a slow process, right? And it also taps into that definition of despair as a kind of interminable death or dying, right? The sense of hyperventilation is that you breathe in less air every time, but you're still getting enough to survive. Something is falling away, and so that experience, that sort of notional awareness, is something that has come upon me with more potency, I think even just in the last few years, than it did in the 10 years prior, you know, because I also when you're an adolescent, I'm speaking generally, when I was an adolescent, I should just speak for myself, you know, I was working on just figuring out who the hell I was and what I could do and what I couldn't and what I loved and what I didn't. So there wasn't as much time for ruminating on things that require you to have a certain integrality in order to even sense them, if that makes any sense. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But I think once I had some of that, then the inkling of the magnitude of that problem started to disclose itself a little bit more to me. And obviously the work that I'm doing with John has facilitated that as well, and given it shape and geometry and vocabulary and all that jazz.
That clip is from my conversation with Christopher Mastropietro, who's been a collaborator with John Vervaeke in his project on the meaning crisis. I want to make a video today where I pull a bunch of stuff together that I've been working on for a while. John's work is hard to clipify. He's got 50 episodes of Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, listening to a number of people about it. Some people really love eating it up. Some people find it hard to watch. It's much more academic. It's basically college lectures. Andrew Sweeney is a blogger. I did a conversation with him a long time ago, but he was sort of on the, Andrew and I have sort of been on the same beat. Andrew lives in France, and he's blogging about this stuff. Did a lot of blogging about Jordan Peterson on Medium, and he's been sort of blogging his way through John's series. And so if you have difficulty watching 50 hours of video or sort of keeping up with the enormity of the project that John has, Andrew's blog is good to follow. He hasn't finished getting all the way through the 50 yet, but nice tight summaries of sort of what John is doing and giving it some perspective. Now, I wanted to play some of this because this morning I saw via Twitter a really interesting review of Tom Holland's book Dominion on First Things. First Things is a Roman Catholic blog, very smart people blogging. This is in some ways Christian conversation at its best. And before I get into that on Tom Holland's Dominion, which, as I've said in a number of times, I think is a very important book, I want to first set the scene by using what John's been doing. Because John, I wanted to start with Christopher's observation, the afterglow of a dying star. That's what he felt Christianity to be in his world and in his life. And again, if you haven't seen my conversation with Christopher, go and watch the whole thing. It's Christopher. I very much understand why he and John collaborate on this. Christopher has an amazing gift of eloquence and articulation, and he's got some of those preacher skills in him that he can take some really abstract ideas and paint them with words into an image that is vivid. When Tim Keller talks about Jonathan Edwards and Jonathan Edwards preaching, that was very much Jonathan Edwards' gift, to take what is huge and turn it, in a sense, into art with words, and that's really Chris's gift. So I want to get into some of John's stuff, and as I said, John's work is hard to clipify because his project is so immense, and so if you really sort of want to get a snapshot of John's work, a lot of the interviews with him are helpful in that. And in this interview on Rebel Wisdom, David Fuller invites John to sort of snapshot his series.
For people who maybe haven't been sort of following it closely, what's the overall frame? What's the elevator pitch for Awakening from the Meaning Crisis?
So the elevator pitch for Awakening from the Meaning Crisis is the idea bringing together two sort of strands. One is an idea that that human beings face perennial problems with their existence because of the centrality to their existence of their ability to make meaning. So at the core of our cognition is our ability to make meaning. It's central to communication, problem solving, I would argue our intelligence, consciousness, etc.
Now, don't get too hung up on the making meaning. If you watch this whole series, you very much have an understanding where for human beings, meaning making is something that isn't just something we do, it's something that happens around us. That gets into the very big, long conversation. Is meaning something that we recognize, or is meaning something that we create in ourselves? And just the framing of that question presupposes a degree of individualism. But so don't get hung up on that aspect. But this first part, that this is in some ways analogous. I've been thinking quite a bit lately about the sort of the analogy of what Brett Weinstein is doing and what John Vervaeke is doing, because I follow both of them quite carefully. And this is in some ways similar to the Brett Weinstein understanding that human beings have two layers of information that are critical for us, and one is the cultural layer. And as I think Jordan Peterson sort of exploded on our radar screen, or on our computer screens, meaning making is so deeply tied into us via our biology. And of course, Peterson's great illustration of that was the lobster, the top lobster who wins the battle, grows, and the lobster who loses the battle shrinks. And life is not so much about happiness, but much more about meaning. And if you go back and search on YouTube, you can find a very interesting conversation done, I think, in 2013 between John Vervaeke and Jordan Peterson, because they both taught at University of Toronto. So very much watch that. I've used clips of that before. So the first strand John highlights here is meaning.
And then one of the main ideas is the very processes that makes our intelligence and that meaning making so adaptive also makes us perennially susceptible to self-deceptive, self-destructive behavior. So cultures across historical contexts, environmental contexts, have generally put together sets of practices for intervening and helping to ameliorate some of these perennial problems of self-deceptive, self-destructive behavior. And then what you need in addition to that,
and a lot of those are, well, we're going to get into wisdom, institutions, and all of that.
Is you need that set of practices to be honed within a worldview that legitimates them, valorizes, sets up traditions, sets up institutions, sets up communities, sets up exemplars, does all that paradigmatic work so that people know how to understand and judge and evaluate and pursue the cultivation of wisdom. And what I mean by wisdom is exactly those set of practices that help us to address the problems of self-deception. The problem that's happened for us is that the worldview within which our wisdom traditions arose has been significantly undermined for a host of very interconnected and complex historical reasons that have to do with things like the Protestant Reformation, the emergence of the scientific worldview, the movements in the separation of philosophy from a transformative set of practices, unlike what it was in the ancient world with Socrates or Plato. We get the loss of wisdom institutions, like the monastic tradition within the West is destroyed because of the Protestant Reformation. So for a whole host of historical reasons, we have a worldview in which we as meaning makers don't belong. And then we also, and that worldview also doesn't it tells us how to get information. And even if you want to give sort of a broad reading to science, it tells us how to get knowledge, but it really doesn't tell us how to cultivate wisdom. Again, not meaning just some lofty ideal. It's like, no, it's, how these problems sink their teeth into people's lives and shred them. And so what's happening is we don't have a worldview that homes, even educates, guides. There's none of that paradigmatic homing for these practices. And so people are bereft. They don't know where to go for wisdom. They pursue it often in an autodidactic manner. They form sort of pseudo-religious responses to try and do the work that has been lost. And so I won't get into all of the symptomology, but there's all of these different things that you can see happening that are a response to this.
Now, he did a video with Christopher Mastropietro where they get into the symptomology of the meaning crisis. And I think that's actually one of the clearest, most important videos that they did for a lot of lay people, as it were, who have, what are we talking about here? Talking about addiction, depression, anxiety, the drug issues, losing ourselves in distraction, all of these types of issues, and Christopher and John do really a good job of walking through those.
So what the series is a historical analysis of how we lost that valorizing worldview, and then a cognitive scientific analysis about what is the meaning-making machinery, what is self-deception, what are higher states of consciousness, what is enlightenment, what is wisdom, what's our best cognitive scientific answer to that, and then can we use that to create what I call psychotechnologies and communities and ecologies of them that can give us back the cultivation of wisdom and self-transcendence, and also connect us up to a worldview that valorizes, homes, legitimates, and makes sense of that set of practices. So that's what the series is all about.
Now, again, I know for some of you who haven't been listening to him, that might have sounded like a lot of word salad, because one of the things that John has done is really helped, and this is what academia does, really developed a vocabulary, and a vocabulary with some precision that we can talk about a lot of the things that religion has done, even though religion is something that has been so... I played one video of Tom Holland's that he gave to a classics club, where, and the audio quality on that video wasn't good, but he talked about the fact that, you know, nobody knew what religion was in a sense until the colonial period, when suddenly people would say, oh, that's your religion. Well, I didn't know I had a religion. Well, that is your religion. And in some ways, it's sort of like what many Christians have been saying to many atheists. Oh, it's not that you're not religious, you just have a different religion. And then they're offended. Well, this process keeps happening. We're trying to figure out, in a sense, like David Foster Wallace's What is Water? You know, what are the assumptions that we are swimming in, the things that are so self-evident to us? Because, as Brett Weinstein noted, the world is not just this thing that appears to our eyes out in front of us. That, in fact, as Jordan Peterson tried to make the point to Sam Harris in their 4 conversations, that, in fact, there's a whole bunch that is built into us in terms of how we see the world. And, of course, John's key idea is relevance realization. And so John's trying to say, okay, why are we having this meaning crisis? Well, what do you mean by this meaning crisis? Why do we have the opioid addiction? Why do we have young men losing their futures on porn, computer games, and drinking? Well, we've had drinking for a long time. Why are suicide rates continuing to climb? Why are levels of anxiety off the charts? What is going on? Why, one of the things that I see often, why are so often people who are raised in our culture so unable to work, which is part of the reason why we import people from the developing world who have been raised in traditional cultures, who in many ways are not suffering from the meaning crisis because they continue to be embedded in these historical religions. Now, we, of course, in the quote-unquote developed world, look at the rest of the world and say, oh, we're on top of things because we have all of this technology, we have all this science, we have all these institutions, and those people are moving to our world, therefore, in some simplistic hierarchy, we are ahead of them. But then when we begin to notice there's sort of this longing for a lost, enchanted world, and we wonder, what have we done? We thought we were just getting some extra sleep and having a round of golf or watching football on Sunday instead of going to the church, because the church it didn't do anything for me. It was bothersome. It was cumbersome. And what's more, it seemed increasingly immoral. So we got beyond it. But now suddenly we realize that there's a hole in our lives and a void somehow that we're trying to fill, and golf doesn't fill it, and crystals don't fill it, and all of these other ways that we've been trying to fill it isn't filling it. The problem is deeper. So where does this problem come from, and why is it here? And that's very much the meaning crisis that John is talking about, and that's this receding star that Christopher is talking about in the clip that I started this video with. Now, one of the things, I got a bunch of things from John here because I selected a bunch of things. One of the things that he talked about is this urgent need for wisdom. And I thought about I still want to do a video that focuses more on wisdom. This will touch on wisdom. And of course, some of the later videos in John's series, he gets into the question of what is wisdom, because wisdom is one of these words that we use it and we say it and we all think we know what we mean. But if you actually pause and ask someone, well, what do you mean by wisdom? Well, knowing what to do. Well, that's very close to relevance realization. And as I get on later in this video, we're going to have the continued haunting problem in John's work of telos, and in many ways, to telos or not to telos is is one of the major haunting questions that we have to deal with. But we have this urgent need for wisdom because we've not only lost wisdom institutions, and in another video that I'm actually not going to play it, but in the question and answer video that I'm going to play a little bit later, earlier, there's this question of, authority. And John mentions, well, someone asks in the question and answer, well, how do I get someone to develop their wisdom? There's, you're barking up a pastor's tree if you ask a question like that, because churches remain to be one of the few institutions that, at least at its inception, was intended to be a wisdom institution that delivered wisdom to its people. Well, what are we talking about? Well, let's jump in a little bit later to this conversation with David Fuller.
How urgent a project are you feeling that this is at the moment?
Well, there's two senses in which it's urgent. One, I think, is kairos. And I hear so many people on your channel talking about that. And I take that very seriously. I agree with that. There's a sense of a kairos here. There's a sense of a turning. And there's a sense, almost like in the biblical sense of da'ath. We've got to get our sensibilities really finely attuned to this turning so that we don't screw it up and we get it right. And so I think that's why this project is very urgent for me, because I want to try and help that turning. Right? But there's also the urgency I take very seriously. The fact that a lot of the things that are distressing, a lot of the things that have been indicated as markers of general systems collapse and civilization collapse seem to be accelerating. I think we have just incontrovertible evidence of ecological degradation, which is what you see when civilizations are, close. We definitely have political ossification, stagnation, and inability for our institutions to solve our problems. We have, we have a breakdown of a shared worldview. We have lots of indications that people are suffering existential and mental strain in ways that are accelerating. A lot of stuff I talk about in the symptomology of the meaning crisis. And that's all happening where we seem to, by many of, and this is Steven Pinker's thing, by many of the measures, he seems to be sort of like, why aren't you just enjoying that this is the golden time. We've never eradicated so much poverty in the world or reduced so much violence. But that's also a marker of a civilization that's about to tip. And so all of these things, maybe I'm wrong, maybe he's right, and maybe his graphs will continue to go right, but I don't think
But his critique of Pinker is well-founded, because beneath Pinker's assumption is that, and this is an assumption that's shared by many of our political and economic institutions, it's sort of embedded in Marxism, for example, which is one of these ideologies that was set to replace religion, that, well, if people have more money and more luxuries and more of what they ask for in terms of a shallow ego or a limbic system, if they have more of that, then they'll be happy, and that equals well-being. Well, okay, so Pinker's got his charts, but then why the anxiety? What Pinker has wrong is his anthropology. Pinker doesn't quite know what a human being is. Now, again, I've used this illustration before. When I visited a gator farm in Florida, I watched all of these gators just sitting around in these pools and had sort of the zoo experience, where you go to a zoo and you look in behind the bars and you think, oh, these poor animals, they're behind the bars. They certainly must be suffering because they're in captivity. And so I asked one of the people there at the gator farm, I mean, don't you have problems with these gators? They're like, nah, if we put them in warm water and we throw chicken at them all the time, they breed like crazy and they seem perfectly happy. It's like, well, why? Well, the conventional answer, it's because they have these small brains, and so they don't have all of this advanced cognition that human beings have, which is why gators make lovely food, but human beings make terrible slaves or terrible prisoners because we get bored. We have all this other cognitive stuff, and then every now and then you'll hear someone, talk wistfully about, oh, these large brains that have given us all of this success. They're such a curse because now we get bored in prison. Wouldn't we be better if we were the alligator sitting in the warm pool of water being thrown pieces of chicken? Is that really our answer? And so, the real problem with Pinker is not necessarily that, well, people are wealthier. The real question behind Pinker is wealthier enough for better? And this haunts the Sam Harris, Matt Dillahunty idea of well-being, that well-being is self-evident and obvious. Well, if well-being were self-evident and obvious, then why all the anxiety? And that's in many ways where John comes into the conversation.
Part of the thing that I've seen is just Jordan Peterson and my work touched a nerve, and other people's work. There's about the meaning crisis, touched a nerve. I have so many people that write in and say, you're putting into words what I've been going through for years, and they don't necessarily think agree with my response or anything, but it's just that there was something going on there. The same thing. I was at a live Q&A a couple of days ago, and people were coming up and you have to take this properly, but people were saying, you sort of saved my life or something, and I don't want to dismiss that. You don't want to go the wrong way with it either. But what I believe they're trying to say is this is an urgent thing in my life and in the lives of a lot of people around me, and you're bringing it to articulation in a powerful way. So I think I pay attention to all these signs, and I pay both the positive and the negative. And like I say, the video that Chris and I did on the symptomology of the meaning crisis, we lay out that argument. I take that all very seriously. And I take the response that I'm getting to my work and related work, I take that all very seriously. So not only do I sense there's a kairos that we got to get right, I think there's a threat that's imminent. And if we don't do something about it, we're going to be overtaken by it.
And, this is sort of, when you listen to Brett Weinstein, you hear that same anxiety. Listen to many, many other people, you have that same anxiety. Now, I think part of this anxiety is sort of normal human psychology. People will often take a look at, let's say, Harold Camping's End of the World, apocalypticism, millennialism. This, if you follow church history, one of the things that you discover is that every age feels themselves living at the edge of the knife, and civilization is about to crumble. And now you should pay attention to the fact that civilizations crumble all the time, and there are smaller and larger collapses of civilization. And also the fact that in many ways, we probably don't see civilization collapse around us, but people looking back in history said, oh, that was the collapse of a civilization. It's just sort of the nature of perspective. So this anxiety business we should pay attention to. We should, as best we can, understand it within a perspective. But, everything that John Vervaeke just said there in terms of my experience following up on the Jordan Peterson meaning crisis with videos and so on and so forth, I've had the same experience. And so that sense, John and I are on the same page. And put a little plug in September, next September, Jonathan Pajot and myself and John Vervaeke will be in Thunder Bay, Ontario, and we'll be doing a conference together. So, this is what we're all dealing with. And some of what we do. Did I not play enough of it? No, I didn't play enough of it. I thought in my mind, I said, I got to go through 2 questions with this. Okay, so let's play a little more.
In that sort of perspective, why do you think that this particular piece about dialogue is the key response to that? If we are threatened, why is that the right focus?
So I want to be careful. I'm not claiming it's any kind of exclusive thing to do. My way of doing of explaining why I think it's how it could play an important role is that I think that we have overwhelming historical and increasingly scientific evidence that people will undergo the significant transformations that are needed in order to address major threats like this, right? They will take serious hits to their standards of living. They're willing to undergo sort of significant political and socioeconomic experiment if they see lots of meaning making is going to come out of it. But if they're in a meaning famine and they're in a scarcity mentality of meaning, they ossify. They lose cognitive flexibility. They lose the capacity for insight. They lose the capacity for aspiration and transformation. And then they become, in a very important sense, rigid, and then they cling on to the other things that they would sacrifice if meaning was more apparent. So if and you and I have been talking about this. We don't mean meaning like in the Hallmark card. Oh, that's a wonderful meaning. We mean, actual practices that will go into people's lives and give them responses to the perennial problems and facilitate them, increasing their sense of connectedness to themselves, to each other, and the world. That's what I mean when I say meaning. And if we can give that to people, I think then people are willing to go through the changes and the sacrifices that are going to be needed to address these other problems. But that's again why we need the religion of no religion. This can't be done on an individual ad hoc basis. That's why the collective intelligence is where we're going to create the religion of no religion that gives people this meaning, right, and gives them the functionality that will do that comprehensive transformation of consciousness, cognition, character, and communitas that we're going to need if we're going to address these issues. So I don't think of it as, I wouldn't say like it's the sole locus, but I think if we don't address this, then people will not have the needed cognitive and existential resources to do what's going to be needed. I see it in my older son's friends. It's like they know that their standard of living isn't going to be right, and they are really worried that the world is dying, and right, and they get all that, but yet they're like, but they're I don't want to be insulting, but they're kind of fragile because they don't, for lack of a better word, they don't have a depth of wisdom, right? So their lives are already so caught up with these unaddressed perennial problems that they have very little left over to address these looming existential threats that they can't avoid acknowledging. And so they're often fragile, and I really, really feel for them in a profound way.
Yeah.
That's the one. That's where I wanted to go. Now, in the question and answer, and this was a really good question and answer that he just did here in January, and there are a couple other segments in this that I was tempted to play the whole thing, but this video is already going to be plenty long. But so this religion of no religion, I mean, that's sort of has tripped some of us up a little bit, and the way he talks about religion, and so actually in this video he really helpfully clarifies what's going on with some of this.
The next question is from the Patreon supporter, Betterment Project.
A regular on our Discord server.
Seems like an appropriate segue from what we were just talking about. So thank you very much for your support. Can you detail why it is that existing religions do not hold the answers to the meaning crisis from your perspective? Now I want to answer that question in sort of a slow step-by-step fashion because, and I don't attribute any incorrect intent from the questioner. But there's two ways in which you can be asking that question. Do I think, let's do one way, do I think that individual people can find in the existing religions ways to cultivate wisdom and self-transcendence? Yes, I do. So I might have answered that question, well, to say that actually I don't think It's true that the existing religions can't give responses to the meaning crisis. I think that they can for certain people. I've met these people. It would be dishonest for me to claim that individual people do not find ways within the existing religions to cultivate wisdom and self-transcendence.
And this gets into my observation about immigrants that I've had for a long time. You have, you know, when the Trump administration, we have this whole conversation about immigrants, and this is why these conversations are enormously complex, because on one hand, countries do have to look at immigration rates. This was a big deal in the Dominican Republic, that a nation of maybe 7 million people had 1 million Haitians living in their borders, 1/7 of the population foreign born. That was a complex, difficult situation. The Brexit question about, how many non-UK people are in the UK. Poe the person had a very interesting conversation on that recently. Germany and bringing in many from Syria and the Middle East, and of course the United States and Donald Trump and his wall. So there's that question. But many of us have long noted that so often many of the immigrants that come into our country are better put together in a way that we have difficulty articulating. And again, part of this, I think, is because they are coming from contexts which are religious. Now, part of what's difficult about negotiating this conversation is that I'm a pastor of a church, so I'm deeply within a religious context. That doesn't mean that my religious context isn't also shot through with all the issues of secularity. John is teaching, he's living in Canada as opposed to the United States. Percentage of people who do things like attend church in the United States are far higher than it is in Canada. So Canada is in many ways more like Europe than the United States. University of Toronto, that's a university context, so far more secular. So part of why we have difficulty talking about this idea is the basic difficulty about talking across human beings in terms of perspective and context and culture and embeddedness and all of these kinds of things. And so that's part of the reason, John, I'm really glad he took the time to answer this question carefully, because actually this question comes up in various conversations I have with people who want to talk with me about John's work.
If that's what you're looking for, that clearly happens. What I do want to make a comment that I notice that those people have a transformative relationship to those religions. They don't simply sort of adopt the religions sort of as in their classic Orthodox form.
Now, and I'm not sure about this observation. I don't know if this even works. I might distinguish, let's say, that the common distinguish between someone who is nominally practicing a religion versus someone who is, let's say, actively pursuing and engaging it. And I think John has a little different frame on it in terms of someone who is actively trying to address the issues beneath the meaning crisis that John spent 50 videos, working through. Because, see, again, this stuff in the context of one human being is so enormously complex and difficult to talk about. Never mind in general or abstract terms or in demographic terms. This stuff is really difficult to talk about. So are we talking about ability to engage in a religion? Because the meaning crisis has been with us. This has been going on for quite a number of centuries. And in some of my earlier videos, when I was talking a little bit more about, let's say, Pentecostalism, it's been my belief for a long time that Pentecostalism is, in fact, more a culture shift than a theological shift. And I think Pentecostalism has, in a way, a deep connection to the meaning crisis. It is sort of a complete denial of, let's say, scientism in some of its forms. I saw on Twitter Frank Peretti's books got brought up. This Present Darkness. I remember when those books came out in the 80s. Those books had a deep impact because suddenly, through fiction, those books plunged people narratively into a Pentecostal worldview. And so when we're asking questions of the meaning crisis, understanding the symptomology, did I say that word right? Someone who, let's say, becomes a devotee of Frank Peretti and living their life deeply embedded within a very participatory worldview in which demons and angels are constantly around. That this came up in Trump's pastor's sermon about some of this recently. This also gets into the perennial traps that we have of fooling ourselves, and so this is enormously complex to talk about. And so I really appreciate the nuance with which John is engaging some of these topics in this section of the video. I'll back it up and play it so it's less interrupted.
They're off. I do want to make a comment that I noticed that those people have a transformative relationship to those religions. They don't simply sort of adopt religions sort of as in their classic Orthodox form. They're often interpreting and transforming them in powerful ways. So if that's what we're talking about, I think it is possible for the individual religions to do that. Now, let's talk about what we might be asking. Do I think that, or do I see these people as they're finding their individual responses to meaning, the threat of meaning loss in their lives, are they also cultivating answers to how those meaning-making projects can be safely rehomed within a scientific worldview that is would otherwise be at best dismissive of them, or is usually critical or deconstructive of them? What I don't see in the existing religions or in these people that I otherwise have deep respect for, and I want that remembered, please, is I don't see an answer to those problems. I often see, like, I'm not going to really think about the science, or maybe a little bit of I'm going to resist the science in some way. I find that problematic. Here's why I find that problematic.
It's sort of a fundamentalist approach, and I liken it to the person that let's say they're a young Earth creationist, but they're dependent on geologists who are using models of Earth science to help find the oil that the young Earth creationist puts in their gas tank. It's the Christian that demands that their church have a biblical cosmology, but doesn't demand that their doctor have a biblical anatomy. So these issues are all around us, and it's very easy to not pay attention to this. If you look at some of my pre-Jordan Peterson videos, there are some of them back there when I was sort of experimenting with video and with YouTube, because I was thinking about the fact that people often don't read books, they watch videos. On my church channel, probably the video that has the most views is a question about how altars work and how altars work in the ancient world. And this is something similar to the kind of stuff that Jonathan Peugeot does on his channel. One of the things that brought me to Jordan Peterson was understanding that when I read Genesis 1, and I prefer to read Genesis 1 in a more archaic translation, such as, let's say, the King James, to a group of people in church where you have an earth and a firmament and the waters above and the waters below, and using that, if you watch my adult Sunday school class, you'll notice that I'll often put the Genesis 1 representation on the board, because understanding the geography of that representation is critical in terms of understanding and interpreting what the authors of the Bible were trying to say. Why is it at Jesus' ascension he goes up? Well, what is up, and what is up there? And what does it mean that in the third chapter of the Gospel of John, Jesus is from heaven, ascends and descends? All of this geography is built into the Bible, yet on Sunday morning, everybody in the pew, or we don't have pews, everybody in the seats would say, well, we're on this sphere going around the sun, traveling through space. And I used to, every now and then, I would get invited to introduce a lesson on what Christianity is to a secular classroom, and almost always would ask the students, how many of you believe the world is round? And they would all raise their hands, and I'd say, how many of you can easily demonstrate to me that the world is round? And the first answer out of their mouths was, I've seen a picture of the moon. It's like, psh, come on, the moon landing, do you really believe that? In other words, you can do the fake news stuff. And I would then bring up the Greeks and the fact that if you watch a mast rise on the horizon, and there are various tricks, but none of them knew those tricks, but they all simply embedded within this worldview. So as a Christian minister, what does it mean for us to be dealing with the Bible and be dealing with a modern audience? As John Stott mentioned, preaching is between two worlds. So, what John is pointing to should not be dismissed. Now, I would argue that there are a lot of Christian intellectuals and some institutions who are wrestling with these kinds of things. I think often they're wrestled with sort of imagining that questions of the Bible and science are sort of this subsection here. And what I appreciate about John's point here is he's right in that this goes far deeper than questions about how many days in Genesis, how long ago, how do we understand that literature. These questions shoot through every aspect of Christian theology and address pastoral care. And what we often see is that whole communities, which on one hand might be declaring the Bible is the Word of God, God said it, I believe it, that settles it, six-day creationist, adopting all of that language formally, propositionally, in other aspect of their lives, are living as secular modernists or even postmodernists, and there's dissonance beneath the surface underneath that is not immediately evident until at some point they decide to give up on one. And so if they read Frank Peretti, they give up on secularism, or if they decide to leave the church, they become post-Christian, and then they're out there very much in the midst of the meaning crisis. And now John is, in a sense, post-Christian. What can we do? We'd like to set up institution wisdom to help these post-Christian refugees in the grip of the meaning crisis. And he said before, well, if you're still embedded within Christianity sufficiently or to a degree, you might not be experiencing that dissonance, especially if you're living in a context that isn't experiencing that dissonance. But because of the stuff built into the world, that dissonance will find you. And so at some point, churches are going to have to deal with this. And I would say churches are dealing with this all the time. They're not necessarily using the framework or the language that John is setting out here, but you see it in the modernist fundamentalist controversy of the end of the 19th century. You read it in philosophers and theologians for the last 200 years, especially in the modernist camp, sort of trying to save Christianity and all these sunk costs from the corrosive, from all of what's happening, and then sort of the reaction. And of course, then you've got the moderates that are actually trying to do the integration, and myself being really in many ways a moderate, someone who's in the middle on these issues. So, John's, I'll hear many people sort of dismiss John for tribal reasons. Oh, his first course was Buddhism and cognitive science. Well, a little bit later in this clip, he's going to talk about that. And he's recognizing that the world has changed, and whether or not people are conscious of the dissonance, that dissonance gets expressed in their lives and in their actions, and you can't simply just dismiss it.
Take very deeply Heidegger's point. You're going to resist the science in some way. I find that problematic. Here's why I find that problematic. I take very deeply Heidegger's point that the scientific worldview is deeply woven into every fabric of our cultural cognitive grammar and in our life. Because here's what part of what Heidegger was arguing. When we talk about science, we don't mean the abstract theories alone inside the ivory towers of academia. We mean the way in which we have an ontology folded around us, supporting every aspect of us. That's technology. Technology is the embodiment of a scientific worldview. So it's kind of strange for somebody to say, for example, while they're on YouTube, while they're using computers, right? I don't really accept the scientific worldview. That's a performative contradiction. That doesn't make any sense ultimately. Like you deeply accept it, unless you just sort of, I don't know, but thinking that what am I hesitating to
Never underestimate the human capacity to be inconsistent.
say? I don't want to be insulting, but if you think that this technology is somehow not dependent on our science, and the hyper technology that's happening right now is so deeply enmeshed, and the technology feeds back and enables the science. They are deeply wedded together, and they surround and permeate our environment, our work, our communication, like how we make use of almost all aspects of our cognition. They give us terms and ways of thinking. Right? People talk about, hardware and software without like that's what I'm talking about. Okay, so the idea that we can somehow neglect the task of resituating meaning making within a scientific worldview strikes me as not existentially viable. Of course, people should, and I engage in discussions with people who do this, make philosophical criticisms of particular scientific theories. That should be done. That should be done. That should always be done. That's very different from trying to say, I just sort of reject the scientific worldview. That strikes me as not existentially viable for us. So I don't see the existing religions sort of en masse. Again, there's probably individual theologians, if that's a broad enough term for the philosophical intellectuals within the existing religions, right? There are probably individual theologians who are wrestling with this. I've read some of them. But do I see the institutions wrestling with how do we reintegrate the psychotechnologies and the practices of wisdom and meaning making into the scientific worldview? Do I see them doing with that? Not that much, because here's what you have to struggle with. That scientific worldview is deeply undermining, and it has been doing it for centuries. And I've made an argument at length about this on the series. I'm not going to repeat it here. It's been undermining the two-world mythos of the axial revolution that gave us an explanation of how our wisdom and meaning making fits into the fabric of reality, and gave us guidance and legitimated our practices. That axial age two-world mythology is disappearing. And I do not see any of the religions providing a answer to it en masse. I'm talking with people, again, I want to be really careful here. Like I'm talking with, J.P. Marceau and Mary Cohen, right? And some of the work that Paul VanderKlay. I see people, individual Christians, trying to say, let's try and break out of the two-world mythology and come up with an alternative ontology that might work. I see individuals doing that. Do I see Christianity as a whole doing that, or Buddhism as a whole doing that? No. And this helps to explain another important fact. So here's two people I've met. One personally, got to have dinner with him. The other, that's Stephen Batchelor. The other is a deep, he's a friend of mine, and somebody I deeply respect, and he's a former colleague of mine at U of T. And that's Evan Thompson. Stephen Batchelor has written a book, After Buddhism. Evan Thompson has written a book, Why I'm Not a Buddhist, precisely for these kinds of arguments. They cannot find within Buddhist modernism, right, anything that addresses this concern that I've just raised. And these are deeply sensitive, deeply people who have practiced deeply, dedicated their lives, right? These are not external critics or dilettantes. And these are people of deep integrity, people who have, were deeply identified with, or at least deeply friendly to Buddhism, making this point. So that's what my concern is. That also helps to explain why I think for many people, it's one of the fastest growing demographics, the nuns, N-O-N-E-S, the established religions don't have an answer. Because how they sort of mesh with, without getting into sort of magical new agey kind of thinking, how religions mesh with the scientific worldview, mesh with this hyper-technology, and mesh with the way the science and the hyper-technology are in ways that we're often not even very aware of, fundamentally altering our cognition. I don't see that being done. And so I think that's why the nuns are, why that number is increasing. So one more point on this, and this is a point that I've made in a recent discussion with Jordan Hall. It was a private discussion, but Jordan gave me permission to talk about it. Right. Answering that question means reformulating our thinking in a fundamental way to get us out of the kind of thinking that has put us into the problems that we are facing right now. That we are facing such dramatic threats that we have to think in a think in a deep sense. We have to realize in a dramatically different way than we have before.
So watch the whole question and answer. That it was really a great question and answer. And again, the point I just made, Christians live in this cross-pressured world. We don't quite know what to do with all of this. Now I want to come into, so usually when I plan another video, it's like which video am I going to do? I got 10 in my head I want to do, and usually I'll read something that'll push one thing over the edge in terms of my salience framework. I've been talking a lot about Tom Holland's book Dominion lately, and I think it's as I've said before, I think it's an important book, and so I was happy to see that it popped up in First Things, and a review of it in First Things. And I, as I do often, I will, if I find a review or something that I think is pertinent, I will just do a little bit of cutting and pasting on my blog. This is actually how, long before I ever started doing videos on YouTube, this is what I would do. I had my blog and something would come up and I would take little bits of it. This before blogs came up, pastors basically would have file cabinets, and when we were in seminary, we were taught that as a minister, you ought to be continually reading periodicals, newspapers, magazines, watching TV, looking for sermon illustrations, points of contact between the two worlds. And so once computer technology came along, I didn't particularly want a file cabinet full of paper because that's horribly searchable and a whole bunch of maintenance to do. I had first various different document management things that I would do, and eventually I just settled on a blog and I put it out on the internet and thought if any other pastor wants to find anything, and that's sort of I have to see if my domain's still working, but you can find it at paulvanderklay.me or leadingchurch.com. But here's this review of Dominion. Now, part of what goes on, if you're deep within the insular, isolated church, especially if you're a clergy, there's this tribal defensiveness that naturally develops where we sort of have a demand, and I certainly am guilty of this and have practiced this often, sort of have a demand of others that they somehow get everything right, even though I myself can't get a lot of things right. And that there's some of that in this book, because anyone who wanders into the area of a particular religion's tribal group had better be prepared for some shade and some pushback and some friction and some tension, because groups zealously patrol and guard their own tribal borders. And so when Tom Holland writes a book like Dominion, there's a lot of smart people in religious camps, and they have access to blogs and things, and they'll push back. So let's see if I can pull up the whole paragraph, that Nietzsche paragraph that I saw. Spend some time in the book review going through the book, sees the importance of the Apostle Paul, reformatio. Holland sees the early and medieval church fostering the characteristic attitude of Western society. He calls this attitude reformatio, a mindset that seeks continuous reform. Now, you hear this quite consistently in... why can't I think of that guy's name whenever I want to think of it? You hear this quite consistently in... when I have these moments when I can't think of 2 or 3 seconds that'll come up, but I'll keep reading. He traces it to the dynamism inherent in Paul's hope to see all people inwardly freed from superstition and cleansed from sin. Holland emphasizes the Christian roots of this moralistic mindset. Whereas antiquity is fearful of the Romans, what Romans called new things, Paul breeds a suspicion of old things. He saw human beings as tempted to revert to habits and worldviews inherent from the past. The Christian ambition for never-ending reformatio altered the practices, manners, and traditions of medieval Europe. You will find that built into the Western university system. You will find that built into John Vervaeke's critique. It's this habit of critique, and especially an emphasis on self-critique that comes to us through Paul and Christianity, Tom Holland will say. The Christian ambition for never-ending reformatio altered the manners, practice, and traditions of medieval Europe. As Holland concedes, it spawned obvious excesses, fanaticism, intolerance, and utopianism. But the project of reformatio gave the West a distinct social attitude whose most revolutionary principles were yet to be seen at the dawn of a new age. As Holland looks to modernity, observes the work of reformatio, turning first against the institutional church and then against the Christian faith itself. In Holland's telling, the roots of the secular Enlightenment are not found in modern science or in the rediscovery of pagan humanism. They are found in Christian moral teaching, whose emphasis on individual conscience and human equality had nurtured a distrust of human authority. Of course, that's deep in the Protestant Reformation and in those transformations. When Holland turns to the radical Enlightenment, however, the book wobbles. Dominion devotes time to Spinoza, Voltaire, and Marx, each of whom saw Christianity as an intellectual blight on Europe and an obstacle to human emancipation. Now, in some ways, Steven Pinker, in his conversation with Jordan Peterson, is part of that tradition. But as I've argued in past videos, and many others have argued, Christianity is deep within Spinoza and Voltaire and Marx too. We're all downstream together in this river, baby. And Jesus critically changed the conversation in deep and important ways, as did, of course, the Greeks. We won't, Christianity, as many have noted, is this weird combination of Athens and Jerusalem, a lot of that put together by the early church fathers. Though Holland does not ignore these figures, anti-Christian animus, he is eager to claim them as natural children of the Christian Revolution. And this is where tribal lines get, because if you're playing the tribal game, you're very much going to put Spinoza, Voltaire, and Marx outside the camp because of all of the things that they said. He does not argue, as others have, that their skepticism and atheism helped to purify Christian thought and life. He claims that they gave a new voice to Paul's hope to see the world purged from error and set on just foundations. Does not Spinoza want us to read Scripture with clear eyes and pure conscience? Does not Voltaire want to eliminate dead ceremony from religion? Does not Marx seek human brotherhood? For Holland, each bears witness to the Christian hope of a new dispensation of universal human amity. Okay, and this is sort of let's take the goods that we have discovered through the long process of Christianity, strip off the religious stuff, and keep the goods. And you will hear Matt Dillahunty make this argument plainly in his conversation with Glenn Scrivener. Here it is. This is what we ought to do. All of this stuff, now that we've discovered this fruits, we can replace the foundations with secular humanist foundations, and the edifice will stand just fine. And many others say, I'm not so sure about that. For Holland, each bears witness to the Christian hope for a new dispensation of universal human amity. The ambition of setting the world on a new order, of purging it of superstition, of redeeming it from tyranny, Holland writes, could hardly help but be shot through with Christian assumptions. Dominion closes with reflections of the spirit of the 60s, feminism, the sexual revolution, as most recent carriers of Christian revolution. And again, before Holland's book came out, I was singing the same song as Holland, which is why when I found the book, I'm like, wow, someone else is saying this too. The culture war is a Christendom civil war. I think it always has been. In many ways, you have Christianity on both sides. You see this played out often within Protestant denominations. Protestantism becomes an institutional fabric by which all of these tensions within Christianity are played out in real time. And all of us have limited time and space. And so when John Vervaeke says, I don't see Christians wrestling with this, I see Christians and Christian institutions wrestling with it constantly. They might not be using John's language. They might not be conscious of these issues, but these issues that John have noted and has spelled out in his series very much are the issues that Christians are battling and institutionalizing and battling as institutions over. Here, Holland's enthusiasm feels forced. I didn't think it was forced. I thought it was clear. He is right, I suppose, that only a culture formed by Christianity's erotic idealism could imagine same-sex marriage. Yes, I think that's true. He is right, too, that our social imaginary, to use Charles Taylor's term, remains unintelligible apart from our Christian past. Today, even our most zealous secularists defend human equality, social justice, and special concern for the marginalized and suffering, ideas that would have seemed foolish, if not incomprehensible, to our pagan ancestors. Holland arrives at his conclusion by way of history, not theory. Our common morality, even in its most progressive expressions, is derived from Christian teachings about the sanctity of the individual. Q. Jordan Peterson. It is a sign of the unique power of Christianity that it can spread its values even while claiming to do the opposite. And I think that's really the genius of Tom's book. That Tom, I think, brings this to the fore in a way that I hadn't seen a book that is potentially popular. And I think that's key to Tom Holland's work. Tom Holland brings history out in a way that I think is popularly accessible to book readers and audio listeners. I'd love to see him get into the movie industry. Could be fascinating. In the past, Christianity spread by conversion. Today, it spreads also by secularization. Now, as in typical of a book review, kind of overlay the book, a little bit of critique along the way, and now you label your yeah but. This is the format, okay? This is the protocol. I wish Holland could tell us when Christian self-criticism became self-destruction. I wish we'd all know that. For if he cannot, others will. Nietzsche looms in the background of Dominion. Holland comes close to saying that Nietzsche was right about Christianity's influence on Europe. Jordan Peterson will come out and say it just as such. But wrong to reject the influence as dehumanizing. Nietzsche loathed Christianity for the same reasons Holland admires it. That's interesting. We'll have to... Tom, I tweeted this out this morning, and Tom said, we hope to talk. Said, let's talk about this. And I thought, this would be fun to talk about. Christianity made us tender and empathetic and shifted the burden of proof against the aristocratic sentiment that tolerates cruelty and inequalities. And you see, I think the point here and why I was so excited to see Tom's book was when I listen to people like, I just played some John Gray stuff recently, when I listen to people like John Gray who will make noises that are so dramatic in terms of recognizing all of this Christian stuff built into it, recognizing all as pure assumption and maybe have to get beyond it. But then when John Gray does his moral critique, he's just like the Christians. And, C.S. Lewis made this point about H.G. Wells, that, on one hand, he wants to say, let's get rid of all this Christian stuff, but he smuggles it in via the morality. You don't need Jordan Peterson smuggling in Jesus to his conversation with Sam Harris. Sam Harris does it all by himself. Christianity made us tender and shifted the burden of proof against the aristocratic sentiment that tolerates cruelty and inequalities. In doing so, it gave us bad consciences, wounding our self-love and pride. Nietzsche mocks Europeans for clinging to Christian values once they have drifted from the Christian faith. Nietzsche had a problem that Nazi Germany lost, and it was the actions of Nazi Germany that drove eugenics out of polite conversation in England and the United States. Holland's response to what Nietzsche has mistaken, Holland's response is that Nietzsche was mistaken to distinguish them. To be Christian is to keep faith with its vision of love and equality, which is in the end requires shedding the dead husks of dogma and the church's exclusive claim to salvation. Right there you have 200 years of theological conversation. The entire Schleiermacher, Tillich, again and again and again. This is exactly what we're dealing with. We're talking about practice and thought. We're talking about where does morality fit into this. Holland discloses that he wrote Dominion after a spiritual awakening. As a young scholar influenced by the histories of Gibbon and Burckhardt, he had assumed that modernity was the rebirth of ancient freedoms after the centuries of religious oppression. Basically, a thesis that Sam Harris and many of the celebrity atheists simply continue to perpetuate. They are doing what Gibbon did 100 years ago. But his belief could not survive his growing knowledge of antiquity and realization, obvious to an honest reader, that the pagan world was morally repugnant. Holland is circumspect about his own faith, and I think Holland has that right. We don't always have to be on YouTube spouting like a pastor what we think. Quoting Tolkien that the Christian story is perhaps a true myth. It is a literary strength of Dominion that it avoids abstract theological discussion. Yes, which is why the book is so important. At least I see that as a pastor who talks to regular people. But it does, of course, presume a theological perspective. All of life is religious. And in this case, a medieval one. That's interesting. In the 12th century, Abelard argued that Christ saves human beings not by satisfying a debt to God, but by changing our perceptions of him. So now the author reveals his theological presupposition, which is that he is a traditional Christian, as am I. But the author continues to be embedded within an entire imaginary. He is within the church, and Tom Holland is not. And so right here we have an estuary, we have a boundary water. But again, as a pastor myself, really as a missionary in many ways, I'm living in the estuary and I'm keeping the paths open. And so a book like Tom Holland's, I think, is vitally important, as was Jordan Peterson. And again, there are a lot of pieces written by like this about Jordan Peterson, and I've made comments like it myself, that it's an estuary position. Abelard's moral influence theory of the atonement as it came to be known explained that God redeemed humanity by revealing the nature of true love. Salvation means moral enlightenment. Holland echoes Abelard's argument in a modern key, but in doing so, he evades a difficult question. He suggests that the influence of Christianity is so pervasive as to be no longer a matter of individual belief. Christianity has become a pattern of deep ingrained social practices, the way we experience and belong to a social group. One can be a Christian without knowing it, even while insisting otherwise. But the problem is obvious. And in fact, probably Matthew Rose Correct me if I'm wrong, Matthew. I'm doing a Freddie call out here if you're watching it. My apologies, but if you listen to Tom Holland talk about his book on like the Delling Pod and Glenn Scrivener's interview and other places on social media, Tom Holland is very aware of this dynamic. But the problem is obvious. Almost none of the Christian heroes of the story believe this. One can be a Christian without knowing it, even while insisting otherwise. But the problem is obvious. Almost none of the Christian heroes of this story believe it. This is exactly the issue that I deal with conversation after conversation with random people out there in the wild. That's part of the reason, even though it's hard to get a slot, I'll open some up again. Part of the reason I leave random slots, as it were, open is so many people now are in this space where they're Christ haunted. They want to believe. They long to believe. They want the fruits of Christianity, but by virtue of them being raised, now I'm talking to a younger generation, my generation, quite a bit raised within the church, that's something that they could go back to. But if you weren't raised with any of this, it's a difficult thing to find. And this is why I loved what Eric said in my conversation with him, Eric Dirksen, pastor from church plant from Davis, California. He said, when people would start nosing around church, showing some curiosity about Christianity, I used to give them a book. Now I tell them, just go to church and keep going. If you want to understand these things, you have to get embedded in it in ways that are beyond your conscious management of your behavior. The rider is really not controlling the elephant. You have to manage the path, to look at what Jonathan Haidt has said. Back to the review. If these men and women are any indication, the moral influence of Christianity requires radical believers who seek first of all communion with Christ, not ethical, political outcomes. Yes, but when you say who first seek communion with Christ, a great number of people are going to scratch their heads and saying, You mean eat the wafer and drink the wine? They have no frame of reference for that. Recently, my family attended an annual St. Martin's Day festival at a local German preschool. We watched as children staged the story of Martin offering his soldier's cloak to a beggar in Roman Gaul. And if you don't know that story, you can read about it in Tom Holland's book, Dominion. I knew some church history, but I continued to learn more by reading Tom Holland. It was really good. I really enjoyed it. The story captured with dramatic simplicity a moment of civilizational metamorphosis, again, which is in the book. It's pretty important in the book, St. Martin. I knew almost nothing about him myself, being a Protestant. A martial identity of antiquity is transformed by the ideal of Christian charity. As the night grew dark, we sang traditional German songs about the light that we carried in our hearts in memory of Martin's deeds. I can only imagine how that would be understood by my New Age-ish friends out here in Central California. The light in our heart? Namaste. As the light grew dark, we sang traditional German songs about the light that we carried in our hearts in memory of Martin's deeds. No mention was made of Martin's faith or of Christ, who revealed in a vision that it was he who was disguised as a freezing beggar. Martin laid a moral foundation of a Christian culture, yet we knew nothing of the West or of Europe, terms that would not come into self-consciousness for use for 3 centuries. The grand narrative of which he was a part was not about worldly power or individual freedom. St. Martin, like St. Paul, believed that the crucified Christ had risen from the dead, and that the world he saw passing away would be made new only in Christ. Now again, me and Matthew Rose, we are very much on the same page in this. And if you listen to my videos, this is again what I'm arguing. Now we've got the two worlds mythology, and now we're wrestling with these things. And again, many people are in the grips of the meaning crisis, say, I want to pray, I want to believe. I just doing it doesn't get to me. Demi Lovato, Luke Thompson. If you don't know Luke Thompson, you're not on the... Hey, look at my conversations with Luke. Go to the Discord server. Get to know Luke out there. Sends me a video of Demi Lovato singing this song about she prays and no one's there and no one sees her. And I mean, that song is just the grip of the meaning crisis. I guess it was from the Grammys. I threw it up on my blog. Our modern conceit is that no other age has been so near the culmination of history and so essential to its redemption. Holland's book seems to participate in this conceit, imagining that we, unlike St. Paul, see the inner truth of Christianity, which is reformatio. But St. Paul teaches otherwise, as have Christians throughout the centuries. So again, Matthew Rose, he centers right down on it. And the problem with Tom Holland's book is that it's insufficiently Christian, which the problem with Jordan Peterson is that he only acts as if God is real. I mean, okay, fair enough. He's not in your tribe. But understand the vital role that these authors and speakers speaking to very secular audiences are making in the estuary. Again, my conversation with Eric. So Eric's a friend of mine, and Eric and I get together quite regularly, and I so wanted to get him on my channel because Eric is very much a man worth knowing. And hardly anybody wanted to watch that video. It's fairly low numbers on my channel, but talked about, these things right there in the middle of it. And so in that sense, of course, how would John Vervaeke know that this is happening in the church if people like me in the church don't reach out and say, John, we want to talk about this. Let's talk about this because we are dealing with it and we recognize your contribution. And John very much reaching out to me and reaching out to us. And fortunately, John hasn't taken off on a status rocket yet. So, we still have access to John. But, this is belief and practice. This is what we're doing. This is what we're working on. I want to bring in another stream into this because TV opens up the contemporary zeitgeist in ways that even our newfangled space on YouTube doesn't. Over the last couple of weeks, I've been hammering down The Good Place. Very interesting TV series. And again, whereas in many ways I was wringing my hands over how tightly Dr. Oz is going to get his grip around Jordan Peterson because we get into that space. But again, people like Jordan Peterson and Tom Holland, they have a vital role in the process that John Vervaeke is talking about here. Now, part of the culture of reformatio that stands between all of us is this continued critique. And again, part of what I really love about what John is facilitating in this little corner of the internet is that we can have differences and still have productive conversations. This is vital because it's, we're always liable to blame someone for not being me or not thinking like me and not projecting my way of seeing the world. Well, this goes back, in my opinion, to the Garden of Eden because that was the problem with God. He didn't want to run things our way. So that's just normal for human beings. So The Good Place has been on TV, and season 4 is on this year. And so I've been through 3 seasons, and I'm just starting to get on season 4 through the purgatory of on demand, where I have to watch commercials instead of seeing it on Netflix or having it on a DVR. Now, clearly, there's a lot of philosophy going on beneath the series, and you don't have to watch the series if you just search for The Good Place or Philosophy of the Good Place on YouTube. The Google algorithm will take good care of you because there's some really good, high-quality videos that touch on this. It's sort of amazing that this creator of The Office and of Parks and Rec has now taken on doing a philosophy course in the guise of a sitcom with romantic subplots in 22-minute episodes. It's quite an accomplishment, really. And the story begins very much with a 2 worlds axial age mythology. This is, again, what I call common religion. There's a point system for good and bad things, and this is how, in a sense, you see morality weaved into this. Do good. You saw this in My Name is Earl, another TV sitcom that got regular treatment in my sermon work here at Living Stones. My name is Earl. My name is Earl used karma, which I find in Central California to be the most commonly understood language, where we're post-Christian, but we've brought karma in. Now, again, you're going to have to check out Nathan Jacobs, Becoming Truly Human, some of the talks that he gave to the Orthodox Church, his study and his experience as a millennial coming through this. Now, he, of course, went through PhD in philosophy, PhD in theology, life as an artist, teaching, now into filmmaking. Let's see. I'm previewing all of my slides. So, two-age mythology, or two-world mythology here. There's a point system for good and bad things done, and you get enough points and you go to the good place. Fail to earn enough points and you go to the bad place. And again, as Nathan Jacobs pointed out in all of his conversing with millennials, with post-Christian millennials, well, there's a bunch of things. They could no longer trust God. They could no longer believe that the Bible was authoritative. Maybe the Bible was a good book along with all kinds of other books, so on and so forth. Pretty much this is the sort of the standard majority opinion of, at least, in the middle brow and lower class American imaginary. This is religion. This is how people conceptualize. But the thing that many millennials get caught up on is exactly this question of life after death. They can't shake that. And so a sitcom like this, I imagine, just grabs certain people because, well, is it It's a Wonderful Life? Is it Heaven Can Wait? Hollywood has been playing these tropes for a long time. Now it comes on to a sitcom and they're actually dealing with some of this, and there's a lot of philosophy being worked on underneath the surface. And again, if you haven't watched the show and you want to see some videos on that, I'll put some links to some in the notes here below. I'm going to put a lot of links in below this video. Now, getting into season 3, I'll try and reduce the spoilage here, but a problem has developed, and it's exactly the same problem as that wonderful piece on the strange persistence of guilt by Wilfred McClay, where you can listen to it. I'll put the link to it in the notes here. What happens when just living puts you in some ways into a Calvinist situation of debt, where just being a modern Western consumer means you will never get enough points to make it to the good place, because even the bouquet of flowers that you bought for grandma is morally tainted by the sweatshop cell phone and the Bezos Amazon network that you used to acquire the flowers to give them to grandma. Your final attributed points for gave 12 roses to grandmother as a birthday gift is -4 points, pushing you more towards the bad place. That this is in a sitcom, that people find this compelling, it's exactly the same reason why David Brooks pointed to the strange persistence of guilt. Has everything to do with woke religion and all of these other issues that we see getting batted about this civil war within Christendom. We have borrowed morality from the axial age mythology, and I'm not sure it's going to be stripped out. In fact, you almost can't get on YouTube and not fully comply with the norms and the propositional truths of this axial age morality. And again, listening to John Gray fascinated me, because on one hand, probably clearer than most in an academic setting, doing what Tom Holland is basically doing in Dominion, saying, our morality, it's all just Christianity. Nietzsche said this. But, okay, so how are you going to live without it? Well, in fact, even if you're just merely Christian, that's now insufficient for certain groups of people. It's an astounding place we find ourselves in this culture, and morality being embraced with the naivete that Christian Smith noted in his sociological work that I think was so important and so prescient when he came up with this idea of moralistic therapeutic deism. That is the default position. If we're talking about how regular folks, what their real religion is, moralistic therapeutic deism. Morality governs. Okay? And that morality comes from Christianity. It's built into, we might, what's interesting about The Good Place is that in some ways, sort of a simulation framework gets us out of sort of the two worlds mythology, but the moral foundations are by no means going away. They're front and center in the show in many ways, often uncritically, as they have to be in order to be on network TV. And so part of what we're seeing in, I've done as much complaining about anybody about the management of the Jordan Peterson movement, of Jordan's management of the movement. I mean, how much, and this gets into the question of, if you haven't watched the Mouthy Buddha video, Why Everybody Hates Dave Rubin, that's, I think, a key video in this whole movement. Now I got to remember to put that one down below. And if I mention anything in the video that I don't put the notes in, make a comment on it, and I'll either add it to the comment section or put it back in the notes later. But all of these things are bound together. And so in sympathy to Jordan, you can't really get into the meaning crisis and not start stepping on toes in the moral imaginary, not come face to face with moralistic, therapeutic deism. Again, all those three words chosen by Christian Smith are foundational to what we're dealing with. Now, Christian Smith wrote his books in the 90s and 2000s. This has moved on from there, and these are, of course, the hot issues of our present culture war. But death haunts us, and we have the strange persistence of our storied self. And again, in The Good Place, this is front and center. It's front and center. They're wrestling subtly, not always. In some of the episodes they are, but they're wrestling with the questions of, to what degree am I my story? To what degree am I my memoried story? They're dealing with that in various things. And they're dealing with the simulation. Voth, of course, said, the simulation argument is creationism for atheists. But in many ways, they're dealing with the simulation thing, which very much gets us right back into the lap of Cartesian dualism. These things are deep within the culture, and they're not going anywhere anytime soon. Which in many ways brings me to the book of Ecclesiastes and Ecclesiastes chapter 3. There's a time for everything, a season for every activity under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to uproot. That became a very popular song. What do workers do? But what do workers gain from their toil? I've seen the burden God has laid on the human race. He has made everything beautiful in its time. He has set eternity into the human heart. What does that mean? We are haunted by these dualisms will persist. And I don't think on a mass scale the continued commitment to our storied self, which I think leads us straight into the kinds of two-world mythologies that we're dealing with. I don't think these are going to go away anytime soon, partly simply because, as Brett Weinstein noted, we are these two-track creatures. And, look at the book of Ecclesiastes. This is dealt with throughout the book. which sort of brings us again back to Jordan Peterson and the clip that I played in my last monologue video where Jordan, what is religion? Religion is what you do. And notice again with the Dirksen conversation, practice and belief. And Vervaeke, we need practices, we need communities, we need, communities that are practicing psychotechnologies to relieve people from the meaning crisis. And in many ways, again, part of the reason I think John is really important is because John Vervaeke is dealing with very much in the midst of this estuary, the flow out of Christendom. And then the question, what are we flowing into? But all of John's 4 Ps, and I think this is, John, again, and John and I have talked about this. We're having a conversation tomorrow. This language is so helpful. These 4 Ps of knowing, and what happens when you put things out there is it goes out there in the world and other people chew it up. And so someone on the Discord server nicely packaged it in this format, which I, threw up on my blog. John's 4 Ps of knowing. There's propositional knowing, which is one-dimensional, eternal, applied throughout time and space, very much tied to the monarchical vision. Okay, someone asked me on Twitter, how is the monarchical vision tied to scientific thinking or the scientific vision? They're deeply tied. And this is where I think if we're resisting the dualisms, propositional truth isn't going away. It's the grammar, it's the vocabulary. We can't deal communally with one another without dealing with propositions. It's one of the layers, but they're all important. And John just did a conversation with another individual about, I forget the guy's name, a friend of Jung that he talked about on his channel. I forget his name. You'll put it in the comment section. But just again, one of John's recent conversation, and John nicely laid out the 4 Ps in terms of how they flow together. Procedural is sort of 2-dimensional, moving from one state to another. Perspectival is sort of 3-dimensional, examining propositions from different angles, using different hermeneutics and heuristics. And participatory, so the 4th dimension is time, remember, is 4-dimensional, experiencing something in time and space. All of these come together and are deeply tied with one another. We don't escape any of the Ps because in terms of how we live, they are one bundle. And so religion has to be one whole thing. In many ways where when John and I talk, we come down to, I mentioned this earlier in this video, to tell us or not to tell us. Because in some ways, part of the Buddhist vision is anti-narrative, and I'm sure I can be corrected in that, and I'm open to correction in that. But it's a vision, okay? And there's elements of that in Christianity too. You can't help but consider the divine comity and the beatific vision and this view of heaven, which is very to tell us or not to tell us. That is the question. Whereas in many ways, the narrative vision of this progressive, we're on a journey heading to a destination, and the life is the journey versus, let's say, life is the destination. And so we're dealing between these tensions all the time. And Christianity with a narrative human being, the good place very much is part on the telos end. What is the outcome? What is the destination? But it's the process of moving to that destination. But deeply involved in all of these projects, for Vervaeke and for Weinstein, is the question, what does it mean to save us? And I think about the Neanderthal, What were the Neanderthal? Did the Neanderthal have a large enough brain to consider their destination? We can bring in Yuval Harari and wonder, are we going to be subsumed by a new creature? Is the fact that the the universal basic income. There's a candidate who's Andrew Yang's talking about that, because what are we going to do with people who don't have the relevance realization capacity to manage this new world? Is the pause and the sobriety that the rise of Nazism put on the eugenics conversation? Will that just kind of keep it beneath the surface as increasingly more and more children are born through artificial insemination and these types of methods, which is sort of implicit eugenics? What does it mean? What does it mean for us? Difficult questions for us to answer. Oh, that's my last slide. I'm not sure I like how that wraps up, but this is where we go. So usually as a preacher, go back to the beginning. If you want to, how do we deal with the setting of the sun? How do we deal with, is Jesus really going away? Or is this the continued hand-wringing and anxiety that we've been dealing in theology and philosophy for the last 200 years? The afterglow of the dying sun. Will religion get changed? Yes. Religion will have a structure, which means elements will get changed while other elements preserve other narrative threads. And what happens is that keeps going back and forth and being pulled together. Read Streams of Living Water by Richard Foster. I usually have that one handy here. There it is. I knew I had it close. Let's see. I got a whole bunch of my normal reference books. Here's Soul Searching by Christian Smith, to get a sense of, well, now the millennials are, and the Xers, who they are religiously, what their assumptions are. Streams of Living Water in Christianity, this process has passed. Are John and Brett right? They have a real point that at the end of that question and answer video, John mentions my point that I make often, that Christianity has embedded within it the resources to try the natural breakings and governors, that some groups will surge ahead and some will hang back, and all of this is sort of alive especially in Protestantism, because you have all these experimental communities with their own hierarchies and governing structures, but especially in an interconnected information age, they're all borrowing from each other. Well, the afterglow of a dying star, maybe that's how one person feels, but Christianity, as I think Tom Holland's Dominion notes, keeps coming back into play. Or maybe human beings are the new Neanderthals, and we're on our way out. So all of these, or it's a simulation. Creationism for atheists. We're playing with these ideas, and we're playing with these ideas even on TV. So I don't know how long this is, but thanks for watching.